Hey guys, it's Josh with Budget Mechanic. Today I'm going to be showing you how to replace the alternator on a 2006 Hyundai Accent. And this got the 4-cylinder 1.6, which is in a lot of your Kias as well, so this will be applicable. One thing to note, when you do this job, you will be draining the oil and removing the oil filter to get the alternator out. So if you're close to an oil change, this would be a great time to do it. But let's get started. So the alternator is right down here underneath your power steering pump. And we're just going to go ahead and break it loose and drop it straight out the bottom. First thing, disconnect the battery. Probably a 10 millimeter. And you want to take the negative cable off only because if you were to remove the positive terminal and your wrench was to hit something metal on the car, which is grounded to the negative terminal, you could make some sparks and potentially cause some problems. So it's always best to take off your negative, because if you happen to hit a part of the car with a wrench, it's not going to do anything. One thing I like to do when I'm working down below on this alternator is pull this little plug off the power steering pump so I don't break it accidentally with the back of my hand. Just a little push tab. Okay, there's only 3 bolts on this alternator we're going to pull off, and 2 on the top, 1 on the bottom. We're going to start with the bottom. Okay, this car is missing the plastic shield that should be here. So I don't have to worry about it, but if yours still is intact, there's going to be some bolts looks like you're going to have to remove that plastic shield. And then the alternator is right here above your oil filter, and there's one 12 millimeter nut that the alternator pivots on that we're going to loosen first. And we're just going to loosen it so that the alternator is able to pivot and we can get the belt off up top. So once it's kind of loose there, I'll just leave it alone. Next, we're going to loosen the belt tensioner on the alternator itself. 2 bolts. First one you're going to go for is this locking bolt right here, 12 millimeter. For now, I'm just going to loosen it, not take it out all the way. Then I'm going to move to this tensioner bolt right here. And this is going to actually release the tension from the alternator belt. So now once that bolt is loose enough, I can actually pull it up out of the little groove. So that will enable you to flip this belt right off the alternator. So before we take all these bolts all the way out and drop the alternator, we need to disconnect these wires. The first of which is a plug right here on the top. It's got a tab towards the radiator fan. You just push it in and it comes right out. Tab right there on top. So then the second is the power wire, just bolted on underneath this plastic cap, 12 millimeter nut. And this is why you don't want to do this after the alternator is loose, because it's so hard to break loose a tight nut when it's floating in space. So you want to do it while it's still bolted in. Okay, now the nut is off. Just push that wire to the side. Now that the alternator is disconnected from the wires, I'm going to pull out this bolt here that we first loosened, and so it'll come out like that. This just slides in and out, make sure you don't lose that. Now that the alternator is disconnected, there's only one more thing we have to do to drop this alternator, and that's to get rid of the oil filter which is in our way. In order to do that, obviously we need to drain the oil. This is a great time for an oil change, but if you don't want to change your oil and want to reuse it, obviously make sure you use a clean drip pan. You don't want to wipe the drain area a little bit, get rid of any loose dirt. And then it's just like an oil change. 17 millimeter bolt right here. I've learned to always tighten up the plug if I ever put it in, so that I don't forget that I only finger tightened it and then drive away. I'm going to move my pan over. I'm going to reuse that later. Okay, now that we got the filter out of the way, I'm just going to cut this little zip tie holding these wires to the bottom of the alternator. Oh, nice, it actually unclipped, which is great. The bracket that the alternator's sitting in right here is actually slotted on the top, so you can pull the alternator up and out of that slot without removing this bolt. Unless this is a really tight fit for you, sometimes you might need to pull the bolt out and get a pry bar in there and pry it forward. Just a little wiggle and lifting upwards. And there it comes. All right, as always, we want to compare a new part, make sure it's going to fit before we get in there. So I'm checking for, obviously, my bolt layout. I'm checking the back, make sure the plug style is the same and in the right place. Also on alternators, I like to check to make sure this spacing is the same, because if this is not right, I get into pinch points and it makes it really difficult. So I'm just going to switch over this bolt to the other alternator and drop this into the slot. I'm just going to finger tighten this nut on here, and then I'm going to make sure that it's all the way seated properly against the alternator. If it isn't, I might just do a couple turns with the wrench so that there's not too much slop with the alternator in that bracket. Otherwise, when you put the belt on and tension the belt properly, then it can readjust itself if there's too much play here. So that's pretty good. This piece we took off, the tensioner, it's going to be oriented like that with the long bolt on top. And it's just going to go right into the side of the alternator through the bracket. Lift the alternator up on its pivot. So just kind of take some fishing, find that hole if you can't see it. There we go. Finger tighten this all the way down. All right, I've actually found that putting this belt back on, all three of these pulleys, is actually pretty easy from the bottom. Okay, so I'm just going to stick it up from the bottom here. And I'm going to loop it over the top water pump. And then hopefully I can even get around this alternator. Bam! Now that the belt is over the alternator, I can pull this tensioner bolt up and let it go into its slot. Might have to back it out a little bit so it falls in its little slot here. And then I'm just going to finger tighten that as much as I can, starting to put tension on the belt. So as I'm tightening this tensioner bolt, I've got this long screwdriver pressing on the belt in between the crankshaft pulley and the water pump in the back here, and I'm just kind of testing as I go the tension, and I want it to end up at that point between those two pulleys. I want it to be kind of firm, but I don't want it to be rock hard so that where there's no movement. So I want there to be a little bit of give, but not a big springy bounce. And then ultimately, if you start up the car and it's squealing, you know it's too loose. But you want to avoid over tightening because you'll wear out the bearings a little faster on your pulleys. Now that our tensioner is where we like it, we're going to lock it in place with the locking bolt and firm that right up. And that's going to hold that in place. Throw that over the bolt, get our nut on there. You kind of want to wiggle it a little bit as you're tightening that nut down. Okay, finger tight. Checking again, make sure it's kind of seated on there properly. You could also do this from the bottom if you wanted to. And just snug it on there. Get this plug in here and then click it into place. And then last one, I'm going to replace that power steering plug. Last bolt on the alternator. I'm going to come down here and just cinch this guy up. Don't need to get too crazy on it. It's not that big of a nut. You don't want to break it. So the alternator is locked into position. It's also a good time to check your belt tension to make sure it didn't adjust when you tightened up your last two bolts. You can kind of push it right here between the alternator and the crank. Just push it in the middle and it should have a little give to it. You should be able to kind of pull the belt, rotate it, but you shouldn't be able to rotate it so that you can see the bottom all the way. Like, that's a pretty good tension there. So we're going to put this filter back on. Before I do, we've kind of been messing around a lot in this area, so you just want to make sure that this filter surface is clean of chunks that would make your filter leak. Oil filter back in. Just want to hand tighten this. Not over tight. So now we can go and fill the engine back up with oil, and you're going to want to throw on your plastic shield on the bottom if you've got one. Since I don't, I won't. I'm reusing this oil, so I'm just going to put it in a easier to pour jug. He's going to need an oil change pretty soon. So that wasn't too bad, right? I do recommend, however, once you get the new alternator in, give it a check. I have made a video on how to do this. You can check out the link in the description. But hopefully this was helpful. Thanks for watching. If you haven't already, do subscribe, and we'll see you next time.